go ahead and get started. So got it. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Everyone, welcome to this ISMTE Office Hour event. It is hosted by the Early Career Committee, and I am Tyra Turner, an Early Career Committee member and moderator for the event. Just to let you know, the office hour is an informal discussion, low key, and hopefully interactive. We can share our experiences, inform the group, and just learn and grow as a community. Today's topic is the editorial office. It is the core component of the ISMTE organization. It's why we are all here. So I think it's really important to be talking about what's going on in the editorial office. You know, empowering editorial offices around the world is what the organization does. So this is going to be a great topic, a great discussion. You may not know very much about the Early Career Committee. There are several committees that you could be a part of if you're a member, but we are here as a resource for professionals who are new to the industry, mostly 1 to 5 years, perhaps, or due to their careers. We're here to help build community and provide opportunities like this one for professional growth. And then you should also know that the 101 series is specific to the Early Career Committee. It's something that we are developing. We had an event last year on peer review. And so this is our second session, 101 series session. And we're really excited. It's just a way to kind of break down the topic, kind of have this great discussion, the fundamentals, pull things apart, just get an idea of what's going on across basically the globe in editorial offices everywhere. So that's the 101 series, and we hope to have more, and we hope you enjoy this one. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You can unmute your mic at any time to talk, to answer questions, to comment. That is great. We want it to be conversational. You can raise your hand. You can throw your questions into the comment, throw your questions and comments into the chat and throughout the session. So, and we'll try to get to your questions as we see them. Also, the more you interact with us, the more we can tailor our talk. We can, focus on certain areas that may be of interest to you. So we want to keep you engaged, and we want to make sure that we're talking directly to you and not at you. So that is the housekeeping. And so the first thing I'd like to do before we get into welcoming our guest today is a poll. This is to get like a temperature of the room. So I'm going to launch that. And if you could just go ahead and try to select an option in this poll. That would be wonderful. Current role. I'm going to launch it now. And it's just asking you about the current role in the editorial office. What is your current role in the editorial office? Alrighty. So we'll get the results in a little bit. So the next thing is we want to bring on our guest speaker, Letitia Gloser. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And thank you to ISMTE for inviting me. And also thank you to those who are in attendance. I appreciate it. And please ask me any questions you like. I may not be able to answer them based on confidentiality, but I am happy to generalize to the best of my ability. I'm going to start just by giving a little bit of my background. I've worked in and around publishing in various capacities for a really long time. Already as an undergraduate, I was doing some copy editing and occasional translations. After college, I worked for several years for a small independent comic book company that actually was at the time the third largest comic book company in the US. And that was everything from developmental editing, working on scripts, all the way through to project management part of it, and then proofreading the pages before they went off for separation, even sometimes involved in paper choices. So that was a very global project. I then went to grad school, and during grad school, my side hustle was copy editing. And when I completed my doctoral program, I got a steady gig managing a small specialty humanities journal. That was my start in editorial support work. And I sort of, again, backed into it through copy editing, because I was doing all the copy editing for the journal, but I was also handling the journal's platform, reviewer invitations, making sure people were submitting on time, checking proofs, just, all of those things that happen in the background. And so I think most of us ended up in editorial support through some sort of backdoor or side door. Right? Like nobody goes to college to get a degree in editorial support work. So it's interesting to see how we all got here. I know that in my company, a lot of people have degrees in English and have interests in publishing. I think that publishing piece does bring a lot of people to this sort of work. So Tyra had given me some prompts, things to sort of talk about. And one that really jumped out at me was my philosophy or insight on editorial support work. And I would say, remember always that you are the middleman in an ego-ridden process, right? There's a lot of emotion involved in the parts of the authors. And you have to be able to calm people, solve problems. You also have to be able to say no in a pleasant way. I would say that those are some of the really key takeaways that I have developed in my decade working for Technica Editorial and all the years before that. The next prompt was to provide an overview of the editorial office. And I'm going to begin by
I'm sorry. So yeah, I think that's really interesting, your philosophy that it's all about ego and, well, I guess basically relationships. It's about people, right?
Yes. Yes.
So what? So you do you happen to be like a people person?
It helps, although I will say that I'm actually remarkably introverted. And so having the medium of email often, right, through which to navigate my response to someone's hot-headed reply to a rejection letter is much more helpful than, say, having to deal with them in person, right? Because I can write what I want to say and then write what I have to say.
Right. Yeah, being behind the virtual part, the behind the screens, does that make you friendlier?
I would say no. I try never to be terribly friendly with authors or reviewers, right?
Okay.
I try always to be pleasant but professional, because I never know when I'm going to have to be the hammer.
Right.
Right. And if I have been pleasant and chatty and using their first name all the time, then when they get the rejection letter, it can hurt a lot more.
Okay.
With my editors, I'm extremely pleasant. I know the names of their children. We all know where we go on vacation. I get vacation photos from 2 of them. So yeah, but that's a very different relationship.
Well, why don't we get into a little bit of the fundamentals of working in an editorial office? Just give us the general landscape. I know that you've worked in so many offices. Tell us what the core components are, the roles and responsibilities, and then maybe give us some differences. How are they alike, and then how are they so very different at the same time?
Right. I would start by saying that academic publishing itself is something that can take a little getting used to. Particularly early career people may not have a really strong understanding of like why there is this impulse to publish, why reviewers will provide their services for free, right? Like it's its whole little professional niche that can be new to people. My general comments about editorial offices are indeed going to be general, in part, where I have confidentiality to maintain compliance, but also there are a lot of different platforms, right? We're probably working across Scholar One, Editorial Manager, Scholastica, OJS, right? All these different platforms that we're using, and they can determine our workflows a bit. But there are also different types of editorial work, right? You might be working directly for a professional society, just supporting the editor-in-chief, or you might be working for a professional society supporting multiple editors. And then there are the types of subcontracting work where you're working for a publisher, maybe even across several journals, right? And the professional society may or may not be the publisher. So there's a lot of different arrangements in this editorial space. There are also different types of journals. They're subscription-based, open access, and those are also going to have some effect on the sorts of issues you encounter. You may have to check in manuscripts, you may not. You may have an extremely efficient editor, or you may not. You've got to be very flexible and adapt your work to the situation in which you find yourself on a journal.
So what are some of those roles? What are some of those roles to kind of, figure out like what it is you would be doing for each of those, for working in an editorial office? We have the editorial assistant, we have the managing editor. I know that sometimes you have those roles, but if you go from, if you at one office, they could be doing certain responsibilities, and another office, they could be doing a whole other set of responsibilities. They could be overlapping, that sort of thing.
Right. And I would say that much of that is determined by the person or people you support. For example, your editor may want you to run a check on all the graphics and see if there are any typographical errors in them. Another editor might want you to go online and search keywords from a manuscript's title and make a list of any publications that appear to be related. Other editors might simply want you to just be the hands that make the decisions or send the texts that they want. It's such a personality-driven process in my personal experience. And that's where being relational is really helpful. You need to find out how that person wants you to serve them, because you are the middleman. Right? You are in between the editor, the reviewers, the authors, maybe the publisher, the professional society. And so you have to navigate all of those relationships while keeping your cool and, again, always behaving in a professional way.
Right.
And the better the relationships you have built, the stronger they are, the easier it's going to be to say, go to an editor and say, hey, this situation has come up a couple of times now. Shall we come up with a simple text that I can use to routinely respond, right? And an easygoing editor might say, sure, draft something and send it to me. And a more controlling editor might say, no, always forward the emails to me. I will decide how I want to handle it. So you need to be very, very sensitive to the people with whom you're working.
Megan says that when she worked for Society Journal, she did a lot of other work outside of managing the journal. Sometimes it was related to her work. Like she gives examples like proofreading and that sort of thing, proofreading for the society.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I've done that sort of thing as well. On the specialty journal that I worked on before I was at Technica, I did like, copy editing, proof checking, all those sorts of things. And that's where I think a small society journal is probably most different from working for a larger publisher.
Mhm.
It's going to be a smaller crew, and so you're going to have to wear more hats.
Right.
For some journals, you may have to, for example, check in manuscripts, or if someone else is checking in manuscripts, you may have to double check certain elements of their work, right? Just to make sure that everything's moving smoothly, or if an author comes back with a question and and says, hey, why was my manuscript unsubmitted? Why do I have to, why do I have to send it back? What are you asking me to do? And the further you are up the food chain, the likelier you are to get those complicated or problem emails.
So Letitia, let's break this down a little bit. Let's talk about the office in general. I work for J&J Editorial. I've been with them for 3 years. I think it was great that I started out as an editorial assistant. And for me, I was just doing day-to-day tasks. I had no idea what was going on in terms of the publishing side of things, of terms of the finished product. And so I was very like task oriented. And so for me, it was hard to get to a point where I felt like I had the full view, the bigger picture. And so I would go to ISMTE's resource page and find information on what were the components to the editorial office.
Mhm.
So I think that I would like to kind of break that down and talk about that a little more, about like what are the roles, what it is we're doing. For my office, I work for a society. Actually, I work for a lot of different journals, and I work for a society for one, and it's about new submissions that come in, and it's the day-to-day checks and that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
then I have a managing editor that I work under. And they're telling me, they're giving me the task, but they're not really explaining like what's going on in the publishing, in the fuller picture for that particular editorial office.
I actually don't think that's uncommon at all.
Right.
I think that you're likelier to get that global picture if you do work for a small society journal, right? If you're working for a larger publisher, there are so many moving pieces, most of which are probably not in your editorial support company, right? Some of them may be outsourced. Quite a few of them, in fact, may be outsourced. And the more of that there is, the harder it is to have not only any control over the process, but a really good sense of who is where doing what. And that certainly, I think, is on the rise. 15 years ago, you wouldn't have seen so much of that. More would have been done in-house.
Right. We do have a question from Abby, who says, how closely do you work with production team on the proof and issue corrections?
I don't, in fact. On my previous journal, when I worked on the specialty journal, I had my hands in that every day. The careful checking of all of the examples. It was a music theory journal, and so very highly specialized. So we had these complicated graphs with musical notation that had to be proofread in addition to the text. Now I don't. The firms for which I work either outsource some of that work or have a very few people who do it in-house. And then for one professional society journal, the editors-in-chief check the proofs themselves, because again, it's a specialized journal. And I can proofread anything, but if you give me a lot of math or a lot of equations, a lot of chem draw, I'm not gonna be fast with that. That's not a skill set I have.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of that. I didn't do that before as an editorial assistant. I didn't work with proofs and issue corrections too much. It was kind of like when, I guess towards the end, when I had kind of shown them what I could do, then they would just give me a little bit more work. And where I've worked, proofing is more managing editor work. And so now as a managing editor, I do a lot more of that. Working alongside the EIC and that sort of thing. So go ahead.
I do a lot of copy editing and proofing in my day job and in my freelance business side hustle. But oddly, not for the companies for which I provide editorial support. We have different clients who come to us for copy editing and proofreading.
Right.
Probably has to do with how technical a project is, right? Like
Right.
some clients just want a specialist for a copy editor. They don't want a general copy editor or proof checker. And other companies welcome that. I think it's really the way in which they decide to frame their own work.
Yeah, and for me, it's minimal. So the proofing is more about proofing the issue. And the corrections is when the author says that there's something wrong with their article, it was published, and so then whose fault it is, we have to figure out whose fault it is, and then we have to send all of that information to the publisher. So there's like a process for that, and it's probably different for different journals, but that's also part of that. Now Kevin says, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Most of the journals on which I'm currently working are not ones for which we handle the production as well. So that limits some of my contact. I mean, I'll send something to the production department and say, hey, can you guys figure out where this mistake happened?
So Kevin asks, he says, my current role isn't managing a journal, but in previous jobs where I was, that was pretty much my only responsibility. I did assist with things like our annual meeting if they needed an extra person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just jumping in to respond to Margaret, who had asked if other people had other work in addition to their journals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have a robust freelance copy editing side gig. The copy editing is really what I love.
But I do have a question, if I could jump in, Tyra.
Sure.
So Letitia, you mentioned how much ego plays into kind of some of those relationships in the editorial office with your editors. Do you have advice for ways to handle some of those egos, especially talking about like editorial policy or publications policy, where we are hopefully the subject matter experts, especially since for early career members who may not, they might have only been in the industry for 2 to 5 years or however long, and you're dealing with an editor who's been around it for decades but may not have that specialized knowledge, but they feel like they do.
Oh yes. Yes. I tread carefully, I guess would be the most important thing. There are going to be great resources typically on a journal's homepage, right? There are going to be instructions to authors. An editor may not always pay attention when those were updated, or an editor might not have paid attention when a particular policy has been updated. And right, so like you have to just sort of, I guess, risk offending them and say, hi, just wanted to remind you that we can no longer do X. Here's information from the publisher about why that change was made.
Cite your sources.
Exactly. Oh, always cite sources. Send them the updated instructions to authors, right? Just like copy and paste the relevant paragraph, that kind of thing. And it can help in some cases to sort of present it as this is a fairly recent change, or, this is a change that happened a while ago, but we haven't encountered this situation before. Just want to remind you. Yeah, never call anybody out. Ever. I mean, that's a good motto for life in general, right? So yeah, yeah, and Yeah.
Yeah,
It-
that's
it's
great. I like what you said about write the email you want to write and then write the email you have to write.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Some of these situations can be tremendously frustrating, but there are support systems in place for you, right? Like there are professional society guidelines. There's going to be some representative from the professional society with whom you're in contact, right? Or there's going to be an editor-in-chief who can help you, like, rein in an associate editor who's just not following the best practices. So if you have, or if you can get some best practices documentation, it's nice, again, to have that as a source you can cite.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Great question.
Just having a little trouble getting through the chat. Can't see. I had a question up here. For Shali, asked, many editorial offices nowadays seem to have an additional responsibility of journal development. Which kind of skills and tasks would complement this role?
Gosh, that's a tough one. And it actually does fall outside my purview, right? I am a managing editor, but I'm not a subject matter expert on the materials that we publish, right? I can be pleasant and charming with an author, but it's a journal editor who's going to be better positioned to, say, approach an author at a conference and say, we would love to have you submit this paper. I can help write a call for papers for a special issue or a volume, congratulating someone on an anniversary. But I personally am not, again, enmeshed enough in the subject to help, say, submit or to approach authors to submit to our journal. In terms, again, I'm happy to edit what my editors do. Like if they have a call for papers, I ask to read through that and I see if there are ways in which I can punch it up or make them clarify more about what they're saying. But that's all the role I have. It's pretty minor.
So what does your day look like?
My day is in large part driven by what I find in the email inbox when I open it first thing. What fires are there to put out, right? Are there author queries? Does someone need to submit an addition or correction? Is someone challenging the ethics of a project? Are they grousing that they submitted a similar paper a year ago and they were rejected, and now that they see this other paper has been published and it has some kinship with theirs, right? It's just all that sort of problem solving. And I have to decide what I can respond to on my own, what needs to go to an editor, right? In some cases, my name on the email is not going to help, right? It needs to be somebody further up, someone, for example, maybe who was involved in handling a manuscript or someone who can address concerns about ethics. And I will say, unfortunately, in that line, some people really just like to throw around accusations, and it can get a little bit ugly. People, alleging that their work has been stolen or that their work was not handled correctly because, well, any of a number of reasons. They had a bad lunch date with an editor, who knows? But again, all of that has to be treated seriously, right? You can roll your eyes as much as you want when you read someone's complaint or someone's allegations, but you've got to treat every concern as a serious one. You don't know how far it's going to go up the chain, what the story might be behind something. So yeah, careful reading. Then the next step is to look at the manuscripts and editors handling. Is everything on track? Are there reviewers you can contact? Urge them to actually submit their reports. Do you need to get someone from the editorial board to produce or to provide an adjudicative review for something, right? All these little sorts of smaller tasks. Is your editor actually logging in and doing their part of the workflow? If they are not, is there someone a little further up the chain to whom you can take that? For example, do you have an editor-in-chief who will reach out to an associate editor and say, hey, I see that you haven't handled any of these manuscripts or answered this appeal from an extremely angry author, right? Because like there may be somebody up further up who has more authority than you do. Because I'm sort of in the middle of the hierarchy, I also have to figure out ways to help a lot of the people, a lot of the editorial assistants, deal with problems they're seeing in their offices, right? Like, can I help them write a good email to someone who's upset about something? Can I talk to the publisher at the professional society and find out a way to update our author guidelines so that there's clarity on something that we can use to cite, right? Like, can we introduce better language in our instructions to authors just to avoid certain problems? So yeah, I spend a lot of time just problem solving for myself and for other people.
And how many editorial assistants do you have working in your office?
Gosh, we have at this point, well, again, there are many of us at different levels. In the early career phase, we might have maybe 15 or 20.
Oh, wow.
And then others who are much more experienced. And some of them may be relatively new to our company, but they've, say, been writers for marketing firms for many years, and they wanted to get out of that. So yeah, again, a lot of people who have other ties to publishing and again ended up in the editorial support roles.
Okay.
But yeah,
And
under 5 years with us, it's a sizable population.
okay. And then what about what are the platform that you use? Are you using Editorial Manager or Scholar One or some other platform?
Scholar One and occasionally Scholastica.
Okay, I've never used
I've never used Editorial Manager. I have one colleague who works on an Editorial Manager journal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, Scholar One really seems to be building a bigger clientele, it seems, at least based on the journals I work on, than Editorial Manager.
Okay.
Maybe because Clarivate will tailor it more for clients.
Gotcha. So let's talk about a little bit about workflow.
Mm-hmm.
And about the efficiency of a workflow. What are some of the common issues that come up, and do you have tips or solutions to kind of clear that up, or are there like things that happen that that can't be resolved as is? We do not have a solution as an industry to, it's just something that we have to kind of take because it's just part of the process.
At the moment, I work on some hybrid journals. I do not work on any open access journals. I do sometimes get queries from authors who have been sent to an open access journal and they can't afford the fees. I think that's a problem that the industry is really going to have to grapple with as open access becomes more and more common, right? Because the professional society or the publisher does have expenses. We are an expense for them, right? anybody who gets money anywhere along the way is an expense for them. So there needs to be some revenue coming in, and typically that has been the subscription model. Plan S has led to a lot more hybrid journals, but I'm not sure what the future model is, right, to handle fees for publishing, because that is exclusionary. But on the other hand, if something has to be nicely typeset, if something has to be proofread, salaries are required. So I think that's one of the big challenges facing the journal publishing industry. It's just how they're going to navigate income versus outgo. In terms of workflows, again, I have my ideal workflow, and then I have my actual workflow that I'm thrown into by whatever was in the email inbox or whatever an editor wants. For example, I might have to run 7 reports in 1 week, and that's that can be a time-consuming process, particularly if they want very specialized reporting done. I make an effort to look through and process the manuscripts as quickly as I can, because that's what the authors are hoping for, right? They submitted so they can get published, so they can have this on their CV.
Right.
Anything I can do to speed that along is a useful service to my client.
Right. Yes. And getting into the peer review process. Yeah, there have been some questions in the chat about the peer review process, getting qualified reviewers and that sort of thing. Depending on your office, you may or may not be a part of that in terms of finding reviewers for people. But can you talk a little bit about that, the review process as part of the editorial office?
It's so difficult on many levels. First, like getting your editor to log in and select some reviewers. Getting your editor to log in, it's like that in itself can sometimes be a problem, especially in the summer. When I have training calls with editors, I always encourage them to provide a lot of reviewers, like a lot, more than they possibly think they're going to need. Because if I have to invite those reviewers and traffic them, at some point, I just may have to cut someone loose, right? If they're 14 days overdue and they're not responding to personal emails from me, we have to decide how we're going to handle these situations. In terms of finding qualified reviewers, that's such a mixed bag. The top people in the field often are very reluctant to review. They're writing their own papers or they're running large labs. Sometimes you can get them if it's a paper that really is engaging with something they've published, but they're likelier to refuse to review, in my experience, than to accept an invitation. For those people really at the top of the field. When you get to the sort of mid-level academic people, they're under a lot of pressure. They may not yet have tenure, right? So they're struggling to produce their own work, and they want to review because they get credit for that, a service to the discipline. But do they have time to do a good review? And so I would refine that question by saying finding reviewers is hard enough. Finding good reviewers is harder.
Right.
I'm
sorry, I just want to throw in, because I didn't read the poll, that we are talking mostly 50% to editorial managers. So I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So in terms of, that role and finding reviewers, I personally, as a managing editor, have not had to do that. But as an editorial assistant, I've had to find reviewers as part of doing like a keyword search type thing. I don't know if you've had to do that in any of your roles at any time.
I have. I've also had to find reviewers and then screen them for potential conflicts of interest.
Right.
which is a time-consuming, helpful process. I mean, one would hope that they would, upon being invited, write and say, I'm sorry, I have a conflict of interest. But we all know that sometimes that will happen and sometimes it will not.
Yes,
The
I've been
other,
there. Yeah, I'm so sorry, but I've had just recently 2 reviewers that have wrote in and said that they felt they were in conflict and they weren't sure if they should accept the review. And so sometimes when that question comes in, I keep them general, and then I give them the email address, not email address, but the website and code, and then have them kind of figure out if they think it's appropriate for themselves. But sometimes, depending on what the message is, it sounds as if it may be a more complicated situation, and so I'll send that message to the EIC, and then they can make that decision. And
right.
And sometimes I'm surprised at the decision they make. They're like, "Yeah, go ahead. This is fine."
Mhm. Right. Right. Conflicts of interest sometimes can be as simple as, I don't agree with this person's work. Right. And they can see that as a conflict because they have differing views on a topic. However, that can provide a very interesting and at times very thoughtful report on the manuscript. But yeah, one situation I encounter with some regularity is people writing in asking to serve as reviewers. And that's kind of a mixed bag, I think. I mean, I collect that information and I hand it on to the EIC, but they're asking often because they're very early in their careers and they're looking for something that they can use to bolster their own CV, but they may not have published all that much, right? They may write a very weak review, right? And if your EIC wants reviewers to be people who have published in that specific subspecialty, then the person who writes in and says, hi, I'm just finishing my PhD, I would love to serve as a reviewer, is probably not going to meet the EIC's standards. So yeah, you have to handle those delicately as well, because you don't want to say to them, no, you're not advanced enough in your career, right? That's just insulting. But often they aren't, or yeah, this was several years ago. This is telling tales out of school, but actually it was several years ago. A prospective reviewer wrote to, I think, 7 or 8 different editorial offices. Mind you, like every editor has their own subspecialty within that journal. So somebody who feels that they're competent to review on every subspecialty is actually not qualified to review at that level. So their requests, in fact, can be difficult. Sometimes I know it may or may not be a best practice depending on your publisher. But sometimes, again, someone from the editorial board or another editor on the journal may be a good person to have as a consultant on a manuscript. Sometimes if it's difficult to find reviewers, it's because they've read the abstract and they don't think the manuscript is particularly strong.
Is there anyone out there that can tell us what they do for reviewers, to find reviewers, or for people who are new to reviewing and want to review for the journal? Is there a process or anything that you do in your editorial office? Give us a sense of what others are doing. I know I'm working in for a journal that has posted we call it a little form that people can, put their information in. It doesn't really matter how early in your career is, but you can put in that information, and then that information goes to a list that the AEs have access to, and so they can pull them from the list. Now, there's no guarantee that that person will get picked, but then, they feel value that they're able to, basically put in their information, and the possibility is there. And I think more journals are out there. Yeah, I think there are more journals that are out there that are really wanting early career reviewers to be a part of the process, because it's so hard.
I maintain a couple of similar lists. The sad thing is when someone's on the list, the AEs have access to it, and the person writes a year later and says, "Hi, I sent you all my information and I still haven't been invited." Then you're in the situation of saying, "Well, I'm very sorry, I provided this information to the editors. It is, at their discretion, who they decide to invite." But yeah, it's good to have language that indicates that you will consider the person, not that you will give them opportunities.
Right. Now, Monica says, one of my clients has an early career reviewer program for those newly minted, just starting scholars. Our office collects those CVs, and the executive editors invite a few at a time.
I love it.
So,
love it. That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we did a little bit of we didn't really talk a lot about the submission process, but there's that, working with the editorial assistants. We got into the peer review, new submissions peer review. What about the revised stage? Is there anything there to talk about the revised stage, the paper getting accepted? Once the paper accepted, getting it to the publisher, are there any special, processes or, ways of going about that, or issues that have come up in your?
I would say one of the trickiest issues to deal with revisions and manuscripts that are about to be accepted are permissions. Have the authors acquired the necessary permission forms? This is particularly an issue for medical journals that might require some sort of consent form from a person whose medical records were used for that manuscript. Typically, the editorial assistant doesn't need to see those forms, but the author must have access to them if queried. And any sort of permissions issues can be problems. And it can be hard to explain to someone that, yes, just because you found that picture online doesn't mean that you can use it, right? You cannot use this picture of this scientist because they are appropriate to your work, right? Their heirs hold the rights to their likeness. You must get permission. That I find that is a process that can involve a lot of back and forth with authors. And I have template after template after template of text that I use for them in these situations, because I can't accept the manuscript if I don't have all the completed permissions documentation. The production department is just going to bounce it right back to me. Right. So I have to be very clear with authors. I have to be firm with them. And AI is a mixed bag in that. There are now some free image creation programs that people can use to create graphics. But the interesting thing is that some of those draw on a limited library. So I've seen variations on the same image. So technically they've tried to create something original, but they don't know who has used images from that library in the past. And so they may inadvertently have created something very similar to what's been done before, rather than just, creating their own image or having their child created and, having the child signing a permission form for the child. But yeah, I will also say though, that if the manuscript is ready to accept, that's when I have the most leverage to get an author to comply. Right. The only thing holding your manuscript up is the completed rights link form, from Elsevier for this image you want to reuse. That can kind of light a fire under people at times.
Right. So I have a second poll. This is concerns about performing in an editorial office. What is one concern you have performing a job in an editorial office? And so I've launched that. And if you have any issues you'd like to discuss in this forum today, that would be wonderful. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Let's see. I think we have Kevin. AGU does. This is back to co-reviewers, but I don't know how much about how the program is implemented. Yeah, co-reviewers. That's a good thing. Yeah. Okay, and so we'll look to see polls.
I was just looking at the questions in the chat or
Yeah.
comments in the chat, and this conversation about how stringent we should be at initial submission and when we sort of have to force authors to comply with guidelines. I find that so many manuscripts are rejected either at submission, they're triaged, or they just don't fare well in review. I tend to be, if I have to, step in and help check in manuscripts, and I do oversee admin checks for a couple of journals, I'm pretty forgiving at initial submission. There are a couple of standards that simply must be met. Other than that, if it makes it to revision, first of all, I then have more leverage, again, if the author thinks that they're headed toward acceptance. But the author is more motivated, but also I have not put a lot of unnecessary work on authors whose manuscripts are not going to be even seriously considered for acceptance, right? Like, you don't want to ask them to correct 5 things and then, all the reviewers say, no, this is not a good manuscript.
Yeah, I guess author guidelines is something to think about too. I think that helps. I mean, you're still going to get a lot of, a little bit of mess, with the various submissions. But yeah, author guidelines, I think, are the right language. But
author guidelines would help if authors routinely read them.
I was going to ask if there's a way to make them read them.
If only, that would be a dream come true. Yeah. And, often I mean, I assume this happens for everyone, right? They've submitted a manuscript somewhere else. You're their second choice or their third choice, right? And they just sometimes haven't even bothered to reformat it or update their cover letter. Right? They're just desperate for a publication.
Yeah, I do think that efficiency comes through, 1, a really good protocol, and 2, author guidelines. And what I like about author guidelines, even if they're not followed right away, is that when they write in asking the question that's already there on the website, that I could just point it to them really quickly. And I think they respond really well to it. And I don't have to super, over explain, what the issue is. I just think that that's part, even it may not do as much as we want it to do, but it does something. And I think it's really important to have a good author guidelines to point back to for authors. I think it's a good thing.
I agree. And again, if you think there are weaknesses, that's a nice thing to take to your publisher, right? Like, could we clarify in the author guidelines like X point? And they're very helpful also for pre-submission inquiries. You just direct them, to the author guidelines.
Yeah, and that's another thing, working with a publisher, is that they are taking care of the journal website. You don't necessarily do that. You do have to keep your eye on the website to make sure that the various things are updated in a timely manner. Working with a vendor, a publisher basically is difficult because a lot of times they are not in the same office that you are in. You're working with one person and it's going down the line through some sort of system that doesn't seem to work fast enough. So that's really interesting.
Often because there are elements in that system that are outsourced.
Right.
And so even your publisher has to go to someone else who's going to someone else who's going to someone else.
Right, which is my point. And I think that's just the editorial office is just, you know, in the center of things, kind of managing all of these different pieces, which is, you know, part of why, you know, we wanted to do this, you know, 101 is to really talk about that, and how people are doing that. Um, so,
Yeah.
let's see, but we've got just 5 minutes left, and just wanted to, I guess, come up with some final thoughts. I think did want to see what the reaction was to the poll, but I don't think anyone answered. So that's fine. I guess everybody's doing really great. But yeah, I want to.
Yeah. I think Dominic's point, I agree that it's
Yeah.
unreasonable to expect authors to read the guidelines of each journal is different. And frankly, they are. They are. And again, authors are sometimes just moving from journal to journal or publisher to publisher, even in an effort to place their manuscript.
Right. So, you know, so there are just a lot of components, or a few different components that are hard to, you know, or can be frustrating. Not that it can be due. I find like very clunky workflows are really what bothers me, and why I say that it's important to update a protocol, to have a good protocol and to update it. We have a lot of, you know, transitions where people are going into different positions. I've had to take over new projects with maybe that person not being there. So having a great protocol is really important. And so yeah, we could leave it there. We can ask if there are any other questions about the editorial office or process, anything that anyone wants to share about what they do, about what their office is like. What do you think is important, you know, in making your office work for you? Is there anything out there that we could take with us?
Resources, I think, are something they're going to help everyone. And I see I have a second slide for that. Just and Donna can drop this in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Good documentation is going to help you through so many situations. And most of us seem to be sort of at mid to senior level. When working with new people, I try to drill in from the start that they need to build their documentation. Good templates to communicate with authors, especially very precise and concise templates if you have to deal with a lot of ESL authors. You never want to be wordy in those situations. You just want to be as clear as you can, as precisely as you can. And, you know, so if you've come up with great language, well, you know, write it down somewhere so that you have it for the future. I use my text edit program on my computer a lot, as it's a convenient place to hold things that I haven't filed yet in my documentation. The ISMTE resources page is fantastic. COPE has great information. So yeah, there are a lot of tools that will introduce efficiencies for you, even if, Tyra, as you pointed out, your publisher may not allow you to introduce efficiencies that you see, right, that you think would be great, but we are not always at the level of getting them to listen to us, which is a shame, because we can often see things that could be improved, and even at the level of the individual editorial office, some editors will go for that and some won't. That's where we get back to how personality driven this sort of work is.
So we're just going to leave it there. We want to thank you so much. Thank you, Letitia, for joining us and for being here, and for giving us your expertise, sharing with us your experience. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time out to be here and be a part of this session. And we look forward to doing more of these. And if you have any feedback, you can send your information to Donna at ISMTE. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.